This video is going to show you how to bind the back with fabric that frays. So all edges will be completely enclosed and there will be no raw edge of the binding showing. So you have your binding, which you will follow the pattern to find out the length. And if you want, you can add two smaller pieces together to get a longer piece. But now, and the way you do that would be to sew them together at an angle, like we're about to do now. But to make the loop, we're going to sew these together, and you've got to make sure that we're sewing, I actually had that wrong. Make sure that whatever side is the right side of your fabric or binding, which for this it's hard because they're both, but make sure the right sides are facing each other. Then you're going to sew from one corner of this to the other corner to make a 45-degree angle. You'll now trim this. I like to flatten this seam or open it up, either with finger pressing or pressing with an iron. And now I've got my loop. Now I'm going to, you can put this seam wherever you want. You can put it right at the bottom of the purse. I generally like to put it at the bottom as long as this isn't too thick, and not at the top just because I like to have my flap not have any fold. But if you put together two shorter lengths to make this loop, this binding loop, then you will need to have a fold somewhere on, a seam somewhere on the fold. So I am going to mark, and I'm not sure if I can see it on this blue fabric, so let me see if it shows up. Kind of. I don't think you can see it, but I can see it. So that is going to be one end, and I'm going to fold this in half and mark the other end. This is a fabric marker and it goes away with heat, so I don't need to worry too much about this showing. Okay, so here is where we're going to differ from other general, the way I normally do binding. Normally, I would do binding, I would sew on the right side, then fold my binding up, touching the raw edge, and then closing it. And then sew from the front and try to catch that edge on the back. If you've ever struggled to catch that edge on the back, you know it's very frustrating. And so we are not actually going to do it that way. Especially with all the changing thicknesses of this purse, it can be hard to get it just perfect. So the way that I do it for this pattern, oops, this goes at the top, is I sew, this is for non-fray, or fabric that frays, binding that frays. I sew it to the lining side and down here at the gusset. So I match up my center marks first off. And the right side of the binding is being sewn to, whoops, looks like I have the wrong side of the binding here. Okay, and down here, I match up my center mark, which I don't know if you can see, to the center mark on the back, which I've got to search a little bit for this to find it. Here it is. So I'm going to clip these top marks, and then I'm going to clip the binding all the way around. Now you don't need to use bias binding for this. It will work with just straight on the grain binding, but it doesn't look as good. And it gets wrinkly and it's hard to stretch around these curves. So it'll work much better for you with bias binding. Okay, I'm just going to pick a place and start sewing, and I'm sewing, remember, with a the pattern seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch. Now these curves are the hardest part. I'm actually going to start on a straight part. And I have a button that keeps my needle down. If you have something like that, I recommend using it. Just like before, I fold this away as best as I can. And these curves are generally the roughest part, these bottom curves, because it's so thick. There's so many layers. Okay. Okay, now this is the reason that I do it this way. When you are now sewing from the front, there's going to be different places where it's thicker or thinner. And if you just fold this edge to meet the raw edge and then fold over, it should be okay. But down here, if you put your binding fabric up to the edge and fold it over, you're barely covering this seam. And if you are sewing from the other side, it's really easy to miss it there. So I like to do it this way, and then I fold the binding so that it covers the seam from before, this seam. And then I can fold it, I can adjust the folds as necessary. So if it's a very thick part, I can just make the fabric be less so that it reaches where I want it to be. And I'll just have it cover, just have it cover this previous seam. So I'm going to fold this under all the way around. So I'm going to look at my binding on both sides, make sure I'm happy with how it's laying. Sometimes on these top smaller curves it's hard to get it perfectly flat, but I'm just going to adjust my folds to try to get it as flat as possible. And then I'm going to start sewing this. Now for this it's hard because you've got to move the bottom out of the way. So you can either try folding it back like this or just try shoving it over, whichever way works best. I'm going to actually start over here and do the flat part first. I just pulled over this side to try to keep it out of the way so that my surface can be as flat as possible while sewing. And I'm going to tilt this up also to do the same thing. And for this step, I feel like this bottom edge is the hardest because of this part of the purse that gets in the way. So just take it slow and deliberate and move the other part of the purse out of the way as you can. Okay, so here's the stitching from the front. I'll probably press this to see if I can get this a little bit of wrinkling out. And here's the stitch from the inside. You can see it ended up just following along this seam. But even though you can see it a little bit, it is fairly subtle. And other than the strap, this version is complete.